I really think the FX2 was made with the same idea that Sony had when they rehoused the A7S III into the FX3. Let me explain. Alright, so it seems like everyone is getting worked up over Sony's new FX2. So as someone who's been professionally and personally shooting with Sony cameras for, I would say, almost 10 years now, I just wanted to offer my insight on this whole debacle in hopes that it helps you find a level-minded perspective in the midst of all this outrage and anger. Now, I really get why everyone's mad at this camera. It's a rehoused A7 IV sensor and an FX3 body. It only shoots up to 4K 60 FPS. Crazily enough, it costs almost $3,000, and it has an adjustable angle removable EVF that I don't think anyone really asked for. Basically, it doesn't do anything physically or internally that Sony hasn't already done in the past. You could say it doesn't even match up to anything that the other camera manufacturers have been releasing recently. And look, I get it. I really do. If you're a gamer, this is kind of equivalent to when Sony dropped the PS5 Pro at double the price with no disc tray, but that's a rant for another day. Now, I don't want to add fuel to the fire because everyone's already doing an amazing job at that. Just do a quick YouTube search. Instead, I'm going to look at it from a different angle because I really think the FX2 was made for existing Sony FX users or people who plan on adopting with the same idea that Sony had when they rehoused the A7S III into the FX3. Let me explain. A few years ago, Sony dropped the A7S III, which is considered to be one of the best video cameras out there for pros and enthusiasts. It was actually a camera that I wanted to buy. Not too long after, they repurposed that same camera into the FX3, and oddly enough, they were nearly identical, except the FX3 had a few things such as the body had a couple more mounting points, it was redesigned, it had a top handle, and the software was updated to be more in line with their Cine FX cinema cameras. I believe that's what it's called. At the time, the A7S III retailed for almost $3,500 USD, and the FX3 was priced at around $3,900 USD. Though the specs were identical, consumers still went nuts. Sony sold a bunch of FX3s. Everyone made video essays about Greg Fraser, the famous cinematographer, the Creator movie that was shot on it, and thus the FX lineup was born. Fast forward a few years later, and now I think Sony is attempting to redo the same thing by repurposing that A7 IV into the FX2. Only this time the sensor is a bit older now, and everyone has moved on to greater things like 6K, open gate, and there's honestly some really good cameras out there. Personally, I don't think Sony is ready to unveil their next true FX camera yet because they're still trying to figure out the cost versus the features debacle, especially in today's age. Instead, I think like they always have with their A7 and A6 series, they just dropped a compromised mid-tier option as a placeholder for enthusiasts, and what better mid-tier option than their top-selling A7 IV? From the looks of things, I think they're trying to streamline the FX lineup and offer different budget options similar to their A7 and A6 options, mainly because the FX3 and FX30 sold so well, which is why the FX2 fits right in between. Now, currently, I own an A7 IV and an A7 R5, and the reason I bought the R5 was because the body, the buttons, the menu, and everything on it is essentially identical to the A7 IV. For me, the transition would be seamless, and I can enjoy the upgraded specs of the R5 without having to completely relearn the camera, which includes the buttons, the dials, the menus, the settings, and basically my set of lenses and my preferences. I also own an FX3, and as much as I love this camera that I'm actually shooting on with right now, it always feels like an oddball because it's slightly different both physically and even with the software. For example, when I shoot video, the FX3 is obviously my A cam, and I cycle between the R5 and the A7 IV as my B or C cam. The FX3 has a bunch of mounting points that make it easier to shoot with, run and gun, do vertical, and just professional work, but with the A7 cameras, all you get is the hot shoe and literally the tripod mount. If you plan on rigging any of these cameras up for video work, you're gonna probably need a cage that gives you more mounting options for mics, handles, a fuel monitor, and so on and so forth. The FX3 also has a photography option, but honestly, there's no EVF and the menu is a bit clunky, so I don't even use it for that unless I'm really desperate and I forgot one of these two cameras for photography work. Now, these are minor inconveniences that I've learned to work around, but I'm someone who likes convenience as it tends to help me get things done more quickly, more productively, and obviously more efficiently. If the FX2 honestly had come out around the same time as this A7 IV did, I probably would have bought it over the A7 IV or upgraded to it even, just to streamline my video workflow with the FX3. I guess guess what I'm really trying to say in all this is that the FX2 seems to be the video-centric version of this A7 IV, and it's kind of like the A7S III was to the FX3. I think that if you're someone like me who owns an FX3 as your A cam and you're on a tight budget, but you need a full frame B cam, whether to use as a B cam or destroy, the FX2 doesn't sound all that bad because you won't have to drastically change your workflow and you don't have to blow as much money. However, if you don't fit into any of this criteria, I really don't see why you would spend almost $3,000 on the FX2 when you literally can just save up and buy an FX3 or even get it used for around the same price, or just buy one of these new cameras that came out. The FX2 sits in this weird place of being an FX camera that showed up a little bit too late, not being mid-tier priced enough, but it does offer the convenience for existing FX users such as myself. Like I mentioned before, if this camera literally had come out a few years ago, I would have traded in my A7 IV for it just to match up with my FX3's workflow. However, I do want to make it clear that it's not just the FX2, but currently I just really don't plan on doing any camera upgrades for probably a few years. That's mainly because I think the specs and the conveniences for cameras from all manufacturers have hit their all-time high. So there's no real reason to keep spending all of your money for these little slight upgrades. If you plan to shoot for YouTube or social media, the conversions are going to compress the heck out of your footage anyway. So 6K or higher really doesn't even matter unless the platform actually supports it or you're putting your movie out there in the theater. And 120 FPS is really overrated because, again, no one's gonna watch your 20 minutes of slow mode unless you're Zack Snyder shooting some cool action. I know this is a lot, but what I'm trying to say is if the FX2 is disappointing, just don't buy it. Better yet, stop buying new gear in general and start creating more content to truly understand what it is you do need and what you don't need and how to work around it or find improvements. That way we can encourage all of these brands to actually make stuff that we truly want that solves actual problems. Sales drive everything when it comes to these brands, and if they start seeing little to no sales, maybe they'll actually listen to the consumers and make a product that people will actually want to buy and practically use. None of these caps on my gear have ever stopped me from making content for others and for myself. So if you're letting that stop you, I don't think the camera's the problem, and I think you and your creativity might be the problem. All right, enough of my rant.